You don't know how honored I am that you are all here. I thought to myself, I'll just have a small, intimate group. It's so hot outside. I'll understand. But I'm so thankful for all of you being here. So good, I hope you enjoy the next hour or so when I talk about Fussville Breweries, and then Henry Hecker will be the second part of our conversation. He's going to talk about the evolution of the bottle from 1840 to 1900, which is a perfect dovetail into what I'm going to be talking about. So let's get started. First, I have to tell you I'm very nervous because in this audience are people that know more about my topic than I do. So I want you all to take me with a grain of salt. I'm going to tell you some stories from facts that as I see them, and I'm hoping maybe we can have conversation after. You can all say, Carol, you're all wet, or you can go, yeah, that was something new that I didn't know. So let me start. My first is a confession. I don't like alcoholic beverages, nor do I like the taste of beer. So what the heck, Carol, why are you talking about breweries in Fussville when there are so many other topics about Fussville that you could explore? Well, my husband has the same question. And we were just at Old World, Wisconsin on the 13th of June when they opened up the Whitnable's Tavern. They moved an old tavern from Old Ashepin to Old World, Wisconsin. They prepped it for the 1930s. I got to be there for the dedication. I got to hear talks about breweries. I was in heaven. And so, and maybe you can tell, this is why I chose breweries in Fussville. It's because I love the history of my state. Yeah, where am I in my script? I love the history of my state, particularly Fussville and the little farming communities just like it. Oh. Actually, this is us at Whitnable's, which was so cool. But I love the history of my state, especially Fussville and little farming communities just like it. Beer means more to me than a beverage. It's part of the history of the German-speaking heritage that I personally have inherited, but I've been also embraced and recorded for all these many years. So I chose to embark on a history study of breweries in Fussville. I found many twists and turns. I found more questions than answers, but I also found some shining moments that I can't wait to share with you. So before I begin my brewery exploration, I think I need to tell you a little bit about Fussville. For those of you who don't know Fussville, and how many of you know Fussville? Yeah, I thought most of you would. Well, for those of you that don't, here's a little bit of a history. Fussville was named after the Fuss family. Johann Fuss, the father, Anna Clara, the mother, and their 11 children ages 13 to 32. Johann was wealthy, he was intelligent, he was a colonel in the Prussian army, and he did not want his children, his boys, involved in the Prussian military. So he decided to move them all to America to start a new life in a new land. It's the mid-1840s, and around that time, other immigrants had the same idea, to seek out a new life in a new land. And those that came to this area, this Fussville area, were not all Germans or German-speaking, but many of them were, bringing those old traditions from the old country. Now, land is being sold at this time for $1.25 an acre. And Johann Fuss, his sons, and son-in-law John Castenholz have bought up great parcels of land along what had once been a footpath for the indigenous people who had been forced to cede their land to the U.S. government, and now transformed into a dirt road called Fond du Lac Road. My diagonal road on my map. We know Fond du Lac Road as Appleton Avenue. This road was key to the settlers, offering them access to commerce and trade south to Milwaukee and north to the Fox River Valley and beyond, and Johann bought his patent. Now, a patent of land means Johann was the first person to buy that property, and that's that big square in my lower right-hand corner. He was the first. So he bought on December 27th, 1848, in Section 24, spending $200 for 160 acres, and I believe that's where the Fuss Brewery was located. Now, around the same time that Johann was settling in, Jodocus Adolf Berghauser, and I'm going to call him Adolf from now on, was also said to have bought an existing farm around Fussville. Adolf was from Cologne, Germany. He owned a lot of land back there, but he was a brewer by trade. And when he arrived to America, he turned his attention to building a brewery. Life was hard for those early immigrants, with little medical care available, deadly diseases like smallpox, cholera, accidents in the field, a whole bunch of tragedy for those early settlers. And Adolf was one who succumbed to death only a year after making the difficult journey to America, dying at the age of 47 on August 30th, 1850, leaving behind for me and for many a mystery of where that brewery was in Fussville. Now, after Adolf dies, Johann dies 6 years later. He passes away. The patriarch of the Fuss family leaves behind 160 acres of land to be divided by his wife and his children, and the division was legally difficult from what I've seen on title abstracts. But maps and stories tell me that Johann's son Joseph acquired a portion of that land. Now, while most Fuss brothers in Fussville, according to my U.S. censuses, lived as farmer, Joseph pursues other interests, becoming a successful businessman and, according to his obituary, operating a sawmill and a brewery. In 1859, family stories and maps concur that Joseph owns and operates the Fuss Hotel, located on Fond du Lac Road, the southeasternmost tip of what would have been Johann's property. The hotel's convenient location meant it was the first establishment travelers stopped to on their way going north through Fussville, and even famous land speculator Solomon Juneau from Milwaukee and his wife Josette stayed the night there on their way to visit family in Theresa. And according to descendants, not only was the hotel listed in that area, but also the Fuss Brewery. Time moves forward. Joseph Fuss dies on December 6, 1899, leaving the hotel to be owned and operated by Joseph's youngest daughter, Anna Maria, and her husband, Heinrich Tennyson. My timeline keeps moving forward. Now we have the 1930s when Henry Tennyson, grandson of Joseph Fuss and son of Anna Maria and Heinrich, Henry's wife, Helen Olive Wright Tennyson, and their children have converted the hotel into their place of residence, and they farm the land. And it's from Henry's son, Wilfred, that I've gathered many stories about what the brewery where the brewery might have been, and also what the farm was actually like. I've been so blessed. I was so blessed to meet Wilfred, and during our conversations, he painted a visual picture for me of what the Tennyson farm once looked like. He recalled the barn, a corn crib, a chicken house. He remembered a stone wall, stories of an explosion, possibly connected with the brewery, and he recalled a little structure called the spring house. And stories of that spring house were legendary in Fussville and are key to this part of my presentation. I love this picture. It's my screensaver at home. And that little building on the right-hand side, well, that's the spring house. This description comes from Wilfred's son and daughter, Jim and Donna. So I want you to imagine a clapboard shed standing right next to the highway. A sliding door opens from the north, revealing a small room sunlit by windows. To the right are 10 or 12 fieldstone steps that are leading you down through a bricked archway and into a tunnel reaching back about 40 feet. Inside are 2 artesian springs, one near the entrance bubbling up in a stone pit, the other farther back in the cave. The temperature of the cave was always cool, making it a perfect place to store farm produce in Wilfred's day. And other Tennyson family remembered fetching water from the spring and using the space as a root cellar for storing potatoes, carrots, and canned goods. Now, as I said, the spring house stories were legendary. Here's another memory from another Fussville friend, Mike Szymanski. He remembered as a youth entering at ground level as the cave was built into a hill. The entire cave was made of dark, standard-sized bricks, walls and ceiling. The floor was dirt, always damp and muddy, and sometimes standing water. The temperature was cool. He remembered cooling off there on hot summer days. The depth, he said, was 40 to 50 feet deep. And Mike remembered a small pond nearby that the road went over and going fishing for small bluegill with a big white Tennyson house standing watch right close to the road. Okay, before I can begin or continue the story about that spring house, it's important that I move the timeline of Fussville along because the story of Fussville and that spring house intersect. So let's go back to Fussville. Let me tell you a little bit more about Fussville. So we left the story of Fussville as being a growing immigrant community. The government granted Fussville its own post office in 1864, with Frederick Out its first postmaster. And this is what Carole Hilger, a Fussville settler, remembered about the post office dedication. He said, on the county line at the Menomonee River, Joseph Fuss had earlier established a brewery. Naturally, he was selected as the godfather for the newly born post office, named Fussville in his honor. The godfather was no piker either, for he generously supplied the necessary moisture for the christening of the post office. By 1873, Fussville is thriving. Not only does it have its own post office, but it has its own blacksmith shop, a stagecoach inn called the Fussville House with George Inden, its owner, and saloons galore, including the Jacob Fewer establishment. Now, you're going to notice on this business district map the names of two more breweries, not owned by Joseph Fuss, not owned by Adolf Berghauser, but rather by Joseph's younger brother, John H. Fuss, and Thomas Baines. Now, this is where I get nervous because I think there are people in this audience that know more about this than I do, but I'm going to give it a shot. Here's what I know from my research. Both John H. Fuss and Thomas Baines lived in Fussville and were farmers according to the 1870 U.S. Census. Now, when John H. Fuss's first wife dies in 1872, John marries Margaretha Stoltz. Margaretha Stoltz. That's spelled S-T-O-L-Z. That spelling is important. On January 5th, 1873. Now, she's the widow of Henry Stoltz, who was the owner and founder of the Union Brewery in Milwaukee. Now, Henry died in 1866, and by the time of her second marriage to John, Margaretha has already personally run the Union Brewery herself for 3 years. She rented and later sold the business to a Paul Dagan until the brewery failed. Then, the same year as her marriage to John H., entered Joseph Fuss, our resident brewer in Fussville. He buys the Union Brewery at a sheriff's sale, kept it for 6 months, then sold it to his son-in-law, Jacob Stoltz, S-T-O-L-T-Z. Two different names. I do believe they are two different families, but that's research that I still have to investigate. Now, Jacob Stoltz kept the brewery for 6 months, and then he too sold the business. The company changed hands 3 more times until it was ultimately bought by the Pabst Brewing Company. So here we have Fussville and Milwaukee breweries coming together. Back in Fussville, it appears that Thomas Baines and John H. Fuss are in the brewery business, perhaps with the help of Margaretha. I mean, she ran the business for 3 years. I bet she could add some thoughts about how to run a brewery. But any partnership between Thomas Baines and John H. Fuss was dissolved on December 12, 1873, only almost a year since John's marriage. with Baines's death at the age of 46. And then a newspaper article dated in the Waukesha Freeman, February 19th, 1874, tells that the John H. Fuss Brewery was destroyed by fire, along with the adjoining residence. It was only through the intercession of another Fuss brewery, another Fuss brother, that the Fuss family was awakened and escaped, the article said, without being singed. Fuss descendants have told me this story, and they believe, some of them believe, this was not an accident, but deliberately set by a rival brewer. Now this fire seems to have had a powerful effect on any future brewery investigations that I could find. 1874, I seem to drop off a cliff when it comes to Fussville Breweries. But the story of Fussville still keeps going. It's the turn of the century, and the little community of Fussville is changing. The post office was redirected to Menomonee Falls in 1903, and people have fewer reasons to stop at that little business district because transportation is much easier than it was before. We move again to 1958, time moves quickly, and the village of Menomonee Falls annexes the township of Menomonee, including Fussville, yet that area remains uniquely Fussville. Besides St. Anthony the Hermit Catholic Church and North Hills Country Club, there were several residences and businesses, including its iconic taverns, Schmitz's, the White Chip, Mark and Schuster's, and Vogel's. Now, in 1971, our time is still moving quickly. The Department of Transportation, along with village officials, decides to widen Appleton Avenue in an expansion project. So they widen it, the thoroughfare becomes 4 lanes rather than 2 lanes, which means the demolition of most Fussville homes and businesses built right along the highway's edges. So as we're talking about breweries, it seems fitting that I talk about another brewery, not in Fussville, but in Germantown. The Vogel's Independent Brewery Company was in operation from 1906 to 1916 and located on Fond du Lac Road and Freistadt Road in our neighboring Germantown. Now I bring it up because in 1915, Frank X. Vogel, he was an owner of the brewery. Well, he traded in his shares to purchase the Vogel's Tavern property, located on the northwest corner of Appleton and Good Hope in Fussville. The tavern remained in the Vogel family until 1971, so Frank X called it Vogel's Tavern. When Frank X passed away and Frank J took over, he called it Vogel's Tap, but it doesn't really matter because in the end, in 1971, it, along with the White Chip and Mark and Schuster's, were demolished with the widening of Appleton Avenue. Okay, we're going to bring the intersection of Springhouse and Fussville together. I just had to bring up my favorite picture one more time. Okay, so imagine the big heavy machinery bulldozing and excavating buildings and land that had once been Fussville during 1971. My good friend Jerry Braum worked for the village and the engineering department during the time of the highway's expansion. And he remembered, this is a quote from Jerry, "The Department of Transportation field rep one day invited anyone from the village who was interested to go out to the Tennyson portion of the project to see what they had uncovered before they continued their earth-moving operations in the area. The place nearest to the road had been excavated, which probably included the entrance to the spring house. I had no idea at the time what the structure had been used for. You could get close to the remnants, which was arched stone, but couldn't go under it because some of the stones in the arch were already loosened by the excavation equipment." Ladies and gentlemen, you don't know how much I wanted to see that spring house. As I mentioned earlier, I love the history of my state, especially small rural communities like Fussville, and maybe that's because my ancestors were immigrant farmers. That's me at 13. And I spent summers and vacations visiting the farms of my grandparents and relatives. But in all of my growing up years, never once did I hear of or see anything like the Tennyson Springhouse. And I wanted to see it. Now, you might all wonder, why would you care about seeing a damp root cellar? Well, I thought it was magical. In fact, I thought it was something more than what other people thought of as a root cellar, and I was right. I shared on a Facebook page my interest in the Springhouse and anything brewery-related, and one kind soul introduced me to Wayne Carole and his book, Wisconsin's Frontier Farm Breweries, 1830s to 1880s. Wayne is sitting here. He's the one that's making me nervous. You see, that book was my gold. The information I found there was a perfect match to the stories I had heard, cementing the idea that this property had once been a brewery and that the Springhouse was so much more than a place to store farm produce. In Wayne's book, he speaks of those old-time farm breweries, and I found in his book so many similarities to the Fuss-Tennyson site. Wayne wrote that most farm brewery sites were built on hillsides, overlooking a body of water, as my friend Mike had remembered, with an artesian well located on the property. Jim Tennyson, son of Wilfred Tennyson, remembered that the Springhouse naturally drained into the nearby Menomonee River. Wayne also wrote, in most lagering cellars, there's the clue. It's not just a Springhouse. The architecture was exactly the same. They were built of stone with vaulted or arched ceilings. The typical cellar was about 40 to 60 feet long, 10 to 12 feet high, 10 to 12 feet wide. Wayne's measurements and those of the stories I'd heard matched. Now, sadly, the Tennyson lagering cellar itself has been lost to time and progress. But with gratitude, I thank Jim Tennyson and his family for working diligently to take still images from old-time movies and send them my way. And now I can see what the structure looked like from the outside, along with the cow pasture. And Wayne Carole's illustrations allowed me to imagine what the interior looked like of what I am certain was an historic brewery lager cellar. Wilfred Tennyson and his son Jim contributed so much to this research and presentation. Jim not only brought back images of the Springhouse, but he also found in his younger days and rescued from destruction another important piece of Fussville brewery history. Before the Tennyson house was demolished, Jim walked through his father's old home and discovered and saved what looked like a simple composition notebook. He found, and he didn't realize it at the time what it was, a Fuss brewery ledger with dates from 1859 to 1865. This ledger was not only important to my brewery research, but also to my wider research into Fussville as well. What is recorded in that ledger were all the names of Fussville residents who bought beer from the Fuss Brewery and their accounts. You're going to recall some of these names that I'm going to mention. Familiar Fussville names, not just typed on biographical sketches that I might find in a book or on plat maps, but handwritten, perhaps by Joseph Fuss himself, and bringing to life day-to-day living in Fussville, buying beer from the Fuss Brewery. I found Frederick Allen, postmaster, and his beer purchases. Remember George Inden, tavern keeper and owner, Stagecoach Inn owner? Jacob Fuhr, tavern keeper and owner? I even found Father Weiss, pastor of St. Anthony Church. And on the other page, I found Joseph's mom, Mutter, M-U-T-T-E-R. I'm not very good with my German pronunciations, but mom was buying beer too. And those of you who know your Menomonee Falls history, Menomonee Falls resident Francis Walterlin was also among the Fuss Brewery customers. Jim gave me permission to take a digital copy of the ledger, which remains in safekeeping in the Tennyson family, and allowed me to share a copy with Wayne. As a beer historian, after reading the over 200 ledger pages, Wayne appreciated finding that not only was Fuss beer being sold in kegs, but also noticed that the brewer started to sell his beer, now this word rhymes with flask, flashen. He sold bottled beer in boxes by mid-1863. And it appears that by 1864, bottled beer was a significant part of their sales. Wayne was a little disappointed not to find information about where the bottles were being made, and I have hopes that he is going to find in his antique bottle searching someday a pottery bottle used in the Fuss Brewery. Yes, you are. More information about beer bottles, 1840s to 1900, is coming when Henry speaks up, so that's going to come in just a little while. Look forward to that. So I told you, information about a Fussville Brewery drops off in 1874. This next story was one told to me by Wilfred Tennyson, remembering a time during Prohibition, and you might call this a brewery story as well. Wilfred recalled how the water from the spring house could be brought to the surface with a hand pump, and how city folk came to the farm and paid 5 cents a gallon for that clear, crisp drinking water. But he also remembered that while the clear water was being sold above ground, bootleggers from Chicago, with their cigars and fancy Pierce Arrows and Cadillacs, were below ground using the cave for transforming the same water into beer for illegal sales during Prohibition. Wilfred remembered many a police officer stopping by from both Milwaukee and Waukesha County to sample the illegal brew. And he remembered the smell of malt and the confused look on the faces of drinking water customers as they wondered, where in the heck is that smell coming from? And Wilfred said, "We never said a word." So as I come to the end of my portion of this presentation, I'm still left with questions. What happened to Adolf Burkhauser's brewery? And were there brewery ties between the Burkhauser family and the Fuss family? Just this past weekend, when I was at Old World, Wisconsin, I discovered Doug Huberson's 2019 book, The Drink That Made Wisconsin Famous. And it was a small hallelujah moment when I read Huberson's suggestion that there were 2 brewery sites in Fussville, recognizing the one in Menomonee Township, Section 24, that one I'm confident I know about, and then a second site in Section 14 of the Fussville area. Yet this revelation left still unanswered questions. Was Adolf Burkhauser's brewery within Section 14? Where was the John Fuss Brewery located that burned to the ground? And a question that I haven't even touched in today's presentation, but also I know I need to, is how does Jacob Stoltz, son-in-law of Joseph Fuss, who married the older daughter Clara on June 24th, 1865, how does he fit in the brewery saga? As to a Fussville or a Fuss-Burkhauser tie, I did find one. Not by way of the brewery business, but by the way of marriage, when Adolf and Gertrude Burkhauser's youngest daughter, Jane, and their youngest son, Fred, married into another Fuss brothers family, that of Joseph's older brother, Henry Fuss, and his wife, Christina Esser Fuss. On June 14, 1881, in a joint service held at St. Anthony Catholic Church, Jane Burkhauser marries John Fuss, and Fred Burkhauser marries John's sister Clara. Now, both fathers of the couples passed away long before the wedding, Adolf at the age of 46 and Henry at the age of 50 in 1864. And perhaps the couples raised steins of lager in thanksgiving to their fathers and their families for all the sacrifices, the hard work, and perseverance that went into ensuring that their generation would indeed be blessed with a better life in a new land of America. A new life colored with old world traditions like how to combine hops, barley, water, and yeast into the time-honored family tradition of brewing beer. Now, I would also like to raise a glass to Wilfred and his son, Jim Tennyson, whose stories and support have colored my research and this presentation. Wilfred was born in the Fuss Hotel Tennyson home on September 8, 1920, and he died almost 101 years later on the same land of his Fuss Tennyson ancestors. And I thank him for the memories he shared, and I promise to keep them alive as breweries in Fussville continue to be explored, debated, and researched. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Henry Hecker, coincidentally also with Fussville roots. Henry is president of the McGonigo Historical Society, regional director of the National Federation of Historical Bottle Clubs, a local history researcher, and a collector of local bottles since 1969. It is my great pleasure to introduce Henry Hecker.
I saw Carole's research in the Landmark magazine of the Waukesha County Historical Society a few months ago, and I said, wow, we need to get Carole in our bottle club in Milwaukee. We meet monthly and hear the story. And so that's how I met her, and as a result of meeting Carole, I also met Jill Schmidt, who is a sort of like, pardon the expression, shirt-tail relation, and as a result found my great-great-great-grandmother's grave in Fussville. I knew I had relatives in Fussville, but I had never pursued it. Unfortunately, I don't know where my great-great-great-grandfather is buried, because he died right after coming over from Germany, similar to some of the people that Carole was talking about. Carole was curious what the Fussville bottles might have looked like. And I could make this a very short presentation and say they were probably made out of pottery, earthenware or stoneware, but it gets a little more complicated than that. 99.9% of the chance that they were of stoneware, and I'll get into why, but I wanted to go over a few other ideas as well. So I'd like to go into the kind of the evolution of the beer bottle, and pretty interesting story. Prior to the 1840s, most of the beer was sold in barrels, and if you wanted to get a smaller container, you'd go down to the local tavern and take your bucket or your jug down there and have them fill it up, and you'd take it home. A lot of times it was the kids' job to do that. How much of the beer actually made it home, I'm not sure as a result. With the advent of German immigration, however, well, I should step back a little bit. The early Milwaukee area was largely English and New England, and they were whiskey drinkers. And the Germans brought the idea of lager beer, and that soon supplanted the whiskey. Not entirely, but largely. Kegs could be bought in saloons, taken to social events, the fields and other workplaces, and the spigots opened and the beer flowed. A lot of times, the beer wagon drivers were getting a beer at every stop as they delivered the beer, and the horses were the ones that knew how to get back to the brewery. That's a true story. Right, Wayne? I didn't make that up. Now, some of the early bottles for beer, particularly in other parts of the country, were glass. That green bottle is actually an early Pittsburgh Glassworks beer bottle that was used in that area in the Ohio Valley. And a lot of these were also ale rather than lager beer. The black glass bottle on the lower right is typical of an early beer bottle as well. But the holy grail of bottle collecting for us in the southeastern Wisconsin is the famous Blossom's Badger Ale from Milwaukee, which is a 1840s, 1850s bottle. There's one intact bottle known. There's another that has been repaired remarkably well that a friend of mine has. And I have a fragment about that big. So that's my Blossom's Badger Ale. And again, very rare. It is the Holy Grail. But that was an expensive bottle that was made out in New York. And the whole economics of glass bottles in those days, here, this was the frontier. In the 1840s, there weren't even any railroads. So if someone was going to buy bottles out of glass made at the glassworks out east, they would come up the canals or through the Lake Michigan, and it was very costly. The shipping was probably more than the actual cost of the glass. So it wouldn't have been likely in those early years that many businesses, except a bigger operation like the Levi and Alonzo Blossom's Brewery, they just wouldn't have used glass bottles. The site of that brewery, by the way, is part of the property of the Northwestern Insurance Company, and a few years ago they built another building and expanded. And as far as I know, there were no Blossom's bottles found there. And one of the ideas, not to digress, is at that time glass was so expensive that more than likely, when the operation was sold at auction, the glass might have gone back as cullet back to Pittsburgh to be remelted. And that's why the bottles are so rare. Now, if you ever find one of these, I will gladly pay $20. I don't know why that was so funny. I'm up from $15. So, not to build suspense, I'll kind of talk backwards and say this is the more likely type of bottle that the Fuss Brewery would have used. These are 1850s, 1860s into the 70s style bottles. The one on the left is actually from New Ulm, Minnesota, but it shows very nicely the original tie, cord tie that they would have used to hold the cork in. So there would have been a cork that would have been compressed into the mouth of the bottle, and then it would be tied because of the pressure. And some of these concoctions in those days actually continued to ferment in the bottle, so the pressure would build up, so you had to have a very strong seal. The center bottles are actually early Milwaukee bottles. Taylor and Brother, which was in operation in Milwaukee, they rented a space around 1851. They were also in Chicago and continued in Chicago. And a Hopkins, the bottle on the center right is from the Hopkins and Company business in Milwaukee. Now, you notice I have two types, stoneware bottles and earthenware bottles, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but stoneware is a much more rugged, durable, more highly fired, vitreous product made from clay. Very durable. Earthenware, think of a terracotta flower pot. Much less durable. And when we conclude, you can come up and look at some of these examples. There were a lot of earthenware pottery makers in Wisconsin. Every little town virtually had a brickworks and maybe an earthenware potter, and they didn't mark their pieces. One of those pieces there is made by the Whitewater pottery, but most of the time you can't even attribute them. it's possible that Fussville might have used earthenware bottles because they would have been very cheap. Now here's some examples of some ales and table beers, or what they called family beers. They were lower alcoholic bottles, and there were quite a number of breweries in the area, and these are examples of Milwaukee bottles made around the Civil War. And you notice some of the stamps have banners or shield shapes, kind of alluding to the patriotic times. The bottle on the left from I.S. Meister has a horse embossed on it. I don't know exactly why he had that as his logo, but it's an interesting bottle. And that bottle was actually dug in the dump along the river here in Menomonee Falls many, many years ago, near the lime kilns. The reason I have a Civil War flask with the eagle on it in the center, just to show the style. It's possible Fuss would have had a bottle that had his name on it. They could be under, 20 feet of fill now and concrete, who knows. Now there were other style of bottles by the 1870s that were glass, but in most cases it was the large breweries that used them. And these had various seals with corks, and they often used wire to hold the corks in place. The one on the left actually has like a metal cap on the top of the cork, kind of like a champagne bottle. And the bottle on the far right, you notice there's a little collar below. That would help hold that wire in place. The Fred Miller bottle in the middle actually has the original wire still intact that would have been wrapped around the cork. And oftentimes they also put a foil seal, and you'll see a Schlitz bottle here that still has the foil seal on it, as well as the labels. Now the styles of the pottery bottles changed over time. The earlier ones had longer necks. These are more squatty, and these are extremely thick. And they date more starting around here in the 70s or 80s, and very heavy and thick. And that was because of the highly carbonated Weiss beer that was bottled in these. And that photo on the right is in my collection. I'm really proud of it. It's just a little photo, but when I bought it, I didn't even see the bottles sitting on the floor until I got it home and really looked at it. I said, oh my God, there's pottery bottles. There aren't many photos that have captured the use of these old pottery bottles. But those are Milwaukee bottles. In fact, us bottle nerds can probably identify those bottles on the floor. I think one's a Grisbaum and Karen from the Grisbaum and Karen Weiss Beer Brewery, and the other two I think are Louis Reerbach bottles. Now, the wire here is actually a prefabricated wire that was invented by Henry William Putnam in 1859, and it really started to take over both beer and soda bottle closures across the country very quickly. It's got a hinge on it. I've got some pretty good pictures. I didn't bring one along to show you, but you can see how it works. That wire loop on top hinges down so you could put the cork in and then hold the cork in place with that wire. Now, this is a derivation, kind of on the same theme in terms of being a hinged closure, but it was actually invented by a guy by the name of Frederick Kutcher in 1869. It was not very well adapted. It might have been a little more costly, I don't know. It never really replaced the Putnam cork holder, and the bottles that have them still in place are very rare. I have one example up here. Now the major breakthrough was done by a guy by the name of Charles D. Quillfelt in 1875, he developed what's called the lightning closure. And that's kind of an evolved design over the past Putnam closure, and the fact that now you had an extra clamp. You can kind of see it and look at the center picture, that looped horseshoe shape. If you lift that up, that raises the wire off the bottle and it pulls the cork out of the bottle. It's very clever. And apparently it was fairly easy to manufacture, and there are many, many bottles from Wisconsin that use that closure, as well as across the country. And there were derivations of this as well. Most of these photos are from my collection. It's hard to see, but take my word for it, the guys enjoying the quart bottles of beer in the photo are they're using bottles with the lightning closure. This was a major breakthrough, the so-called Baltimore loop seal. And that was invented in 1885 by William Painter in Baltimore. Makes sense, right? That's why they called it the Baltimore loop. I don't know if you knew that, Wayne. Did you know that? And the photo here, you can see these bottles very clearly. If you look at the center patent diagram, you can see there's a little disc with a wire loop embedded in it. And that disc was press fit into this groove in the lip of the bottle. I'm reasonably sure that when they got to this point, there was the ability to mechanize the capping process. Most of what I showed you up to now was probably hand bottled, which is very slow and laborious. And something in doing the research for this presentation, I found the painter's diagram, which also shows the opener that was used. And that's the second diagram on from the right. And I've had these openers in the past, found them at different places, thought they were basically junk, probably threw them in a box lot at our antique mall and sold them and didn't know what they were. Well, it turns out they're actually Baltimore loop openers, and I'm gonna pass this around. This little hook would be used to pull the Baltimore loop cap out of the bottle, but notice that the later bottle caps were also coming into use, so you could have an opener that would open both types of bottles. Okay, going forward, the lightning stopper was used almost contemporaneously with the Hutter stopper, and the difference with the Hutter stopper is that they had a porcelain stopper instead of a cast metal and rubber stopper. There was still a rubber gasket around the bottom of the stopper. I think one of the reasons this became popular is it allowed the brewer to further advertise. It was another way to put his logo on the product. And I brought one example that's plain, but a lot of these had a enamel type of label put on the cap. Quite attractive. And there actually are collectors. First of all, I got to tell you something. I see I got a question out there. Hold that for a second. I think if you dropped a bomb on the Milwaukee Antique Bottle typical meeting, you would probably wipe out most of the insanity in the area. Bottle collectors are very passionate. We're nuts. I mean, we dig in outhouses. We do all kinds of crazy stuff to find bottles. There are collectors just of these stoppers in the last few years, and they're going for big money on eBay. We used to throw them out when I was a kid. Okay, the real game changer. Oh yes. I'm sorry.
I think we traveled in Germany, had some friends stayed in their home, and they had beer bottles, and I believe that have that type of?
They're very similar. But actually, most of those bottles, the wire bail is actually embedded in the glass, rather than have, most of those bottles will have two holes, not all the way through the glass, but it allows the clamp to snap into the bottle, and it actually swivels on those holes. Yeah, in some of the German breweries, they're still using these bottles today. Yes. The real super game changer was the William Painter. Remember him? He was the guy that came up with the Baltimore loop seal. Well, he scored again when he invented the crown cork, which is the ubiquitous cap that's still used on many bottles today. The photo on the left is one of our bottle meetings. And I believe the lady on the right is Carole, but I'm not positive. By prohibition, this was a standard cap. And there are some different glass lip designs, which I won't get into. Now this is well after the Fuss period, but I thought it'd be interesting to kind of show everybody the different styles of inventions. There were, so who would know that someday the crown cap seal invented by William Painter would have given college students the ability to crack a beer with their teeth. And those are some pre-prohibition beer bottles that are crown cap sealed with the labels. The graphics on these old bottles, when you find them with labels, and you don't dig them out of the ground very often with labels, but you find them in an attic, they tear down a house, they're in the walls. It's amazing what can still be found. So, to answer the question, what were the bottles that the Fuss Brewery used? Probably pottery. The exciting thing is, maybe there's one out there stamped J. Fuss, or Fuss, I should say, or JF. A lot of times, they were charged by the letter. When the potters made these things, they would charge by how elaborate the stamp was. So that's why you see a lot of bottles with very abbreviated labeling on it. Now, every once in a while, you'll see something with a lot more lines. Fussville Brewery, Fussville, Wisconsin. There's a pottery bottle from the North Lake Brewery, which is out, you know where Merton is? Or Heartland, it's out that way. There are pottery bottles from the North Lake Brewery that actually say the full North Lake Brewery, from a brewer by the name of Fredrickson. The answer's out there, or down under somewhere. So I can answer a lot of other questions. I also got a couple of other openers for some of the cork sealed beers that are pretty interesting. Any other questions? If I don't know the answer, I can make it up.
Where did they acquire the cork, since there's no cork trees?
That's a good question. I think there were various materials. I've even seen some corks or some wooden plugs with paper wrapped around them, but they were importing cork pretty early. That's a good question. They were getting it, but it wasn't, grown locally, correct? Yes, sir.
I have two questions. The first one is those wire and porcelain stoppers, closures. Did they develop concurrently in both the U.S. and Europe, or did the Europeans take that from America, or did the Americans get the idea from Europeans?
The best way to answer that is probably. I don't know exactly, but you know how, even in those days, well, first of all, patents were much more loosely enforced in those days, because it was even more expensive, on a pro rata basis, it was much more expensive to take legal action. So a lot of things went like this and just let it happen. I don't know. I will tell you this. I've seen a lot of cases over the years in business with inventions and that sort of thing. There can be some amazing parallel eureka moments where people independently come up with the same idea because prior inventions, lead the next generation of ideas. I had a case in the Historical Society a few years ago. Menomonee has a sister city in Germany. The name escapes me, but the creme de la creme of their students from this high school, one of their perks for getting a certain grade point, they get to come to Menomonee. I don't know if maybe it's a punishment, I don't know. But they always visit the museum. And we have an early typewriter in the display. And you probably know Scholes of Milwaukee invented one of the first typewriters. Well, that's in America. Because I'm jabbering about the Scholes invention, and I had one of the German students almost take my head off. He said, "No, it's a German invention." And in such and such a year, and it was so and so. And I think that was clearly a case of parallel evolution.
The other question I have is, it might be a little further down the road, but do you know anything about the George Meyer company? I believe they were in Bayview, and they invented bottle washing equipment, and they would wash bottles for the big breweries.
I have a very good friend, Peter Moss. I think it's on his mother's side. His mother descended from the George Meyer bottle washing company. I don't know a lot about it, but Peter would know a lot more about it. You got me telling another story. I love to tell stories. One of the things that Peter found out about his ancestor is when he came up with an interesting new version of a bottle wash device. He decided he was going to go around to all the different bottling companies and demonstrate this machine. And he had a local glass maker make a bunch of Coca-Cola bottles, but not the typical style of Coca-Cola bottle. Something of his own. It has the script Coca-Cola vertically on the bottle, but it's clearly not a Coke sanctioned bottle. And he must have made like 100 or something had it made. And that was always in Peter's family lore when he started collecting bottles years ago, that, hey, you got to find one of George Meyer's Coca-Cola bottles that he used to demonstrate. Why he just didn't buy regular bottles, but he wanted something special. And a few years ago, somebody on Facebook dug up one of these George Meyer, apparently, Coca-Cola bottles and had it on the Facebook page. And by the time Peter tried to contact it, disappeared. So we don't know where it is, but somewhere is one of his ancestors' special made Coca-Cola bottles. I don't know, that probably doesn't answer your question, but I had fun talking. I haven't researched the company. Any other questions? Yes?
You might not want to answer this, but how many interesting things have you found in your outhouse?
Well, I'll generalize. You just don't find just bottles, although, you know, a lot of the bottles are liquor because Dad went out in the outhouse to either dispose of the bottle or actually imbibe and not let the family know, even though they probably knew what was going on. So you find a lot of bottles of all kinds. In many cases, the privy or outhouse was actually where the garbage was thrown. You know, they just moved the privy to another part of the yard when it got full, and they cap it over with quicklime and a clay or something to seal it off. And we go in some lots, and there's 8 privies through the years. The older ones are maybe farther away from the house or closer, depends. But you find false teeth. That's a common one. They must have fell in. You find kids' toys. China, when somebody broke a dish, it might have went in the privy. Toothbrushes, early ones, bone-handled toothbrushes, all kinds of really cool stuff. Not to get too grotesque, but when I say we're digging in old outhouses, this is 120, 150, 170-year-old stuff. So the bulk of the contents have broken down into soil. You're not digging through poop to be what you are, but an interesting phenomenon goes on over time. All the seeds, tomato seeds and that sort of thing that people consumed, they end up being preserved, and they're oftentimes, for some reason, in a single layer, they like gravitate to one area, maybe where the water line was. So you find seeds, chicken bones. We dug one privy down by the one of the condos in downtown Milwaukee that was on an old lot, and I don't know how many pig bones and chicken bones and eggshells. You find eggshells and stuff like that. So that's as detailed as I'm going to go. But we're amateur archaeologists. You know, bona fide archaeologists love to dig this stuff because they can learn all about diet, disease, and all that kind of stuff.
But did you find any beer stuff? Did you find any beer bottles?
Oh, yes, of course. Even pottery bottles and stuff. I want to make one shameless pitch for our Aquanago Red Brick Museum, which is open tomorrow from 1 to 4. We do presentations the second and fourth Saturdays. You can go on our website, McQuanagoHistoricalSociety.com, or .org, I should say. Tomorrow I'm doing one on stagecoach inns in the McQuanago area, and that is quite a story. McQuanago at one time was vying to be the county seat during the territorial stage of history, and we didn't get the railroad in 1850 like we had hoped. There was a big fraudulent situation with the Milwaukee-Beloit Railroad, so that never came to pass. So when we missed the railroad until 1874, that really set McQuanago back. I think we've recovered, but I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Good audience, big audience.
Just one other question.
I only allow 2 questions, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I always understood that the reason that the glass bottles were brown was because of light deterioration, that the rays of light would deteriorate the beer. But then my question is, how did Miller get away with always having a clear glass bottle?
Well, most of the Miller products aren't that tasty anyway, so I don't know. No. Seriously, you know, the brown bottle obviously, you know, prevents ultraviolet from getting into the beer, which accelerates aging and that sort of thing. But if it's around my house, the beer doesn't last that long, so it's going to. But I think the Miller used both amber and aqua, what I call aqua or clear bottles, right from the beginning. So it was a marketing ploy.
And see the beer.
Yeah, you could see the beer, you could see it was pure and clear and effervescent and all that. I think probably, Wayne, maybe you'd know, the aqua bottles probably are a little cheaper than the amber bottles, but I'm not sure. Yeah, the whole, you're falling for all the marketing stuff. There were beer bottles that were cobalt blue. So they're olive green and what I call citron or yellow green, just beautiful bottles. So not all of them are amber and aqua or clear. There are other colors out there. And I think most of it was a marketing ploy to make the product stand out. Okay, good question. Thank you.